The year was 1565, and the Mediterranean trembled under the weight of an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Algeria. The Ottoman war machine, unstoppable in its fury, had crushed Byzantine Constantinople, shattered Hungarian armies, and turned the inland sea into a Turkish lake. Yet on a small limestone island south of Sicily, a handful of knights wearing the eight-pointed cross prepared to make their final stand against the greatest military force the world had ever seen. What transpired over those scorching summer months would defy every principle of warfare known to military strategists. When Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent dispatched his armada toward the fortress island of Malta, he expected nothing more than a brief campaign to eliminate the last Christian stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean. The mathematics seemed simple enough. 40,000 of the finest Ottoman soldiers against fewer than 6,000 defenders. Victory was not just probable, it was inevitable. But the Knights of the Order of St. John had not survived 2.5 centuries of warfare by accepting conventional wisdom about impossible odds. These warrior monks, expelled from Rhodes by Suleiman himself 4 decades earlier, had transformed Malta into something far more dangerous than a mere fortress. They had created a killing ground where every street, every building, every grain of sand had been prepared for one singular purpose: to bleed the Ottoman Empire white. The story of Malta's siege represents more than just another medieval battle. It marks the moment when the seemingly unstoppable expansion of the Ottoman Empire met its match in the calculating fury of men who had nothing left to lose and everything to defend. This was not simply a clash of armies, but a collision between two worldviews, two civilizations, and two concepts of what the Mediterranean would become. Today, we strip away the romantic myths and examine the brutal reality of how 6,000 souls held back an empire. To understand the magnitude of what happened at Malta, we must first grasp the world that made such a confrontation inevitable. The Mediterranean in the mid-16th century was a sea divided between two great powers, locked in an existential struggle. On one side stood the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent, a realm that had grown from a small Anatolian principality into the most formidable military machine of its age. Ottoman galleys controlled the eastern Mediterranean, their crescent banners striking terror into Christian merchants and coastal towns, from Venice to Gibraltar. Opposing them were the fractured Christian kingdoms of Europe, struggling to coordinate their response to this Islamic juggernaut. The Habsburg Empire of Charles V controlled much of Western Europe and the Western Mediterranean, but found itself stretched thin across multiple fronts. France, remarkably, had allied itself with the Ottomans against their mutual Habsburg enemies, adding another layer of complexity to an already tangled web of alliances and betrayals. Caught between these titans were the Knights Hospitaller, officially known as the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. These warrior monks had begun their existence in the Holy Land during the Crusades, serving as both healers and fighters in the endless wars between Christianity and Islam. Expelled from Palestine, they had established themselves on the island of Rhodes, where they spent 2 centuries perfecting the art of naval warfare and becoming the most effective anti-Ottoman force in the Mediterranean. In 1522, Suleiman the Magnificent had finally conquered Rhodes after a brutal 6-month siege, forcing the surviving knights into exile. The young sultan, displaying the magnanimity that would earn him the title Magnificent, had allowed the order to depart with their weapons and dignity intact. It was a gesture of respect between warriors that Suleiman would later regret, for the knights were far from finished. After 8 years of wandering, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V granted the homeless order the islands of Malta and Gozo, along with the North African fortress of Tripoli. At first glance, this seemed like a poor consolation prize. Malta was a barren, sun-scorched rock with no natural resources, little fresh water, and a population of peasant farmers who spoke a mixture of Arabic and Italian that even their new rulers struggled to understand. But the knights saw something that others missed. Malta occupied perhaps the most strategic position in the entire Mediterranean, sitting astride the narrow channel that separated the eastern and western basins of the inland sea. Any power that controlled Malta could strangle Ottoman communications between Constantinople and the Barbary coast, disrupting the flow of supplies, reinforcements, and intelligence that kept the Sultan's western territories functioning. Under the leadership of successive Grand Masters, the Knights transformed their rocky new home into a fortress unlike anything the world had seen. The natural harbors of Malta were deepened and protected by massive stone bastions that incorporated the latest developments in military engineering. Star-shaped forts replaced medieval castles, their angled walls designed to deflect cannon fire and create overlapping fields of fire for defensive artillery. The Knights also rebuilt their naval capabilities, launching increasingly bold raids against Ottoman shipping and coastal installations. Their galleys, painted in the order's distinctive red and flying the 8-pointed cross, became a nightmare for Muslim merchants and pilgrims. Every captured ship meant not just treasure for the order's coffers, but intelligence about Ottoman plans and capabilities. More importantly, the Knights had learned from their defeat at Rhodes. They studied Ottoman siege tactics, analyzed the weaknesses that had led to their downfall, and prepared countermeasures for every conceivable form of attack. They stockpiled food, water, gunpowder, and medical supplies in underground chambers carved from the living rock. They trained the Maltese population in the arts of war, transforming farmers and fishermen into auxiliary soldiers who could repair walls, carry ammunition, and fight when necessary. By 1565, Malta had become what military historians would later recognize as the first truly modern fortress, a killing machine designed around gunpowder warfare rather than medieval siegecraft. The Order's engineers had created interlocking defensive systems where the fall of any single position would only expose attackers to even deadlier fire from neighboring strongpoints. The Knights themselves had evolved as well. No longer the heavy cavalry of the crusading era, they had adapted to an age of gunpowder and naval warfare. They were expert artillerists, skilled engineers, and perhaps most importantly, they possessed an institutional memory of siege warfare that stretched back centuries. Many had fought at Rhodes as young men and now commanded as grizzled veterans who understood exactly what they faced. The Order's Grand Master during this crucial period was Jean Parisot de Valette, a 60-year-old French nobleman who embodied everything the Knights had become. A veteran of Rhodes and countless naval engagements, La Valette combined the strategic thinking of a Renaissance prince with the religious fervor of a crusading knight. He spoke multiple languages fluently, including Turkish, which he had learned during a year of captivity as a galley slave following his capture by Barbary corsairs. La Valette understood better than anyone that Malta's survival depended not just on strong walls and brave hearts, but on turning the island's apparent weaknesses into strengths. The lack of fresh water that made Malta seem vulnerable could become a weapon if properly managed. The rocky terrain that made farming difficult could channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The small population that seemed insufficient for defense could be supplemented by carefully planned alliances with the local population. Under La Valette's direction, the Knights prepared for the siege they knew must come. Ottoman raids against Malta had been increasing in frequency and intensity throughout the early 1560s, clear signs that Suleiman was preparing for a major assault. The Sultan's spies reported on Maltese defenses, while his admirals studied the island's harbors and landing beaches. The question was not whether the Ottomans would come, but when they would arrive, and in what strength. The answer came in the spring of 1565, when Ottoman preparations reached a crescendo that could no longer be hidden from European intelligence networks. The arsenal of Constantinople echoed with the hammering of armorers and the roar of cannon foundries. In the naval yards of Gallipoli, hundreds of galleys and transport vessels were assembled and provisioned for a major campaign. Most ominously, the Sultan's best commanders were recalled from distant frontiers and assigned to what Ottoman documents referred to simply as the Malta enterprise. The scale of these preparations sent shockwaves through European capitals. This was not to be another raid or limited assault, but a full-scale invasion designed to eliminate the Knights Hospitaller once and for all. Intelligence reports suggested that Suleiman was assembling the largest amphibious force in Ottoman history, complete with siege artillery that dwarfed anything previously seen in the Mediterranean. As spring turned to summer, the final pieces of Suleiman's grand strategy became clear. The assault on Malta would serve multiple purposes beyond simply removing a troublesome enemy. It would secure Ottoman control of the central Mediterranean, opening the way for future campaigns against Sicily or even the Italian mainland. It would demonstrate Ottoman power to wavering allies and rebellious subjects across North Africa. Most importantly, it would eliminate the last significant Christian naval base in the eastern Mediterranean, allowing the Sultan to focus his resources on the perpetual struggle with Persia. For the Knights on Malta, the approaching storm represented both their greatest challenge and their ultimate purpose. They had not spent 4 decades preparing these defenses to avoid battle, but to fight it on their own terms. As Ottoman ships began appearing on the horizon in increasing numbers, La Valette issued orders that would define the coming siege. There would be no retreat, no surrender, and no quarter given or expected. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of a small island, but the future balance of power in the Mediterranean world. The first Ottoman ships appeared on the horizon on May 18, 1565, their white sails catching the morning light like harbingers of doom. From the watchtowers of Fort St. Elmo, Maltese sentries counted vessel after vessel until the sea itself seemed to writhe with Turkish galleys. The sight that greeted them defied comprehension. An armada so vast that it stretched beyond the curve of the earth, carrying within its holds the accumulated might of an empire that had conquered 3 continents. At the head of this maritime juggernaut sailed Mustafa Pasha, one of Suleiman's most trusted commanders and a veteran of countless sieges across the Ottoman frontier. Beside him commanded Piali Pasha, the Sultan's son-in-law and admiral of the Ottoman fleet, whose tactical brilliance had secured Turkish dominance from the Black Sea to the Barbary coast. Together, these 2 men carried the weight of imperial expectations and explicit orders from Constantinople. Malta must fall before winter, and the Knights Hospitaller must be eliminated as a fighting force forever. The numbers alone should have guaranteed Ottoman victory. 40,000 soldiers crowded the transport vessels, janissaries with their distinctive white felt caps and curved scimitars, Sipahi cavalry whose ancestors had ridden with the first Ottoman sultans, and regiments of volunteers drawn from across the empire by promises of plunder and paradise. Supporting them came an artillery train that represented the pinnacle of 16th century siege warfare. Massive bronze cannons capable of hurling stone balls weighing over 600 pounds. Mortars designed to lob explosive shells over fortress walls, and smaller field pieces that could be rapidly repositioned as the siege developed. Yet, as the Turkish fleet approached Malta's Grand Harbor, experienced Ottoman commanders felt the first stirrings of unease. The island that spread before them bore little resemblance to the descriptions in their intelligence reports. Where they had expected medieval walls and outdated fortifications, they found star-shaped bastions bristling with cannon. Where they had anticipated a few scattered strongholds, they discovered an integrated defensive system that transformed the entire harbor area into a killing ground. The Knights had not been idle during their 4 decades on Malta. Under the direction of successive Grand Masters, they had hired the finest military engineers in Europe to design fortifications that incorporated every lesson learned from the fall of Constantinople and their own defeat at Rhodes. The result was a masterpiece of defensive architecture that turned Malta's natural advantages into an impregnable fortress. Fort St. Elmo commanded the tip of the Sybaris Peninsula, its guns controlling the entrance to Grand Harbor and preventing any enemy fleet from achieving a secure anchorage. Across the harbor stood Fort St. Angelo, the Knights' primary stronghold. its ancient walls reinforced with modern bastions and connected to the town of Birgu by a network of defensive positions. Between these two major fortresses stretched a chain that could be raised to block the harbor mouth, forcing any attacking fleet to approach under constant artillery fire. But the true genius of Malta's defenses lay not in any single stronghold, but in how each position supported the others. The knights had learned from Rhodes that isolated forts could be overwhelmed one by one, so they designed their new defenses to create overlapping fields of fire where the fall of any position would expose attackers to even deadlier crossfire from neighboring strongpoints. Every street in Birgu had been prepared for urban warfare, every building reinforced to serve as a secondary fortress, every approach channel carefully surveyed and pre-sighted by the defenders' artillery. The Great Siege of Malta stands as history's ultimate testament to the power of preparation, determination, and strategic brilliance over sheer numerical superiority. When the battered remnants of the Ottoman fleet finally limped away from Malta's bloodied shores in September 1565, they carried with them the shattered dreams of an empire that had believed itself invincible. The knights had done more than survive. They had broken the myth of Ottoman invincibility and marked the beginning of the empire's long decline in the Mediterranean.